Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending when you're watching this. This week we are moving in our lessons for our children of Let's Learn the Bible from the book of Joshua into the book of Judges. And we're getting near the end of our first workbook. I'm expecting that we're actually going to have a little bit of a break in between ending the first workbook and starting the second workbook. The reason being, the second workbook isn't fully complete yet. Just waiting on a couple things, and then I have to get it printed, make sure it looks good, and then do all the printing for all the copies for you guys. At any rate, that will be coming, and we're going to switch from looking at the Old Testament to a book that I made looking at the stories of Jesus, a bunch of them from the different four Gospels. And then after that, we'll cycle back to the Old Testament. I'll make a third book that will take us through the next portion of the Old Testament. And then I think I'm going to go and make another one about the letters in the New Testament and the book of Acts and whatnot. And the goal here, the long-term goal, something I would like to accomplish, is actually to have these books and activities and whatnot made up to cover the entirety of the Bible at some degree. Some of the books are going to be a lot more in depth, like say the book of Acts or our look into Exodus, versus some other books like the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, definitely Song of Solomon. Those ones we might just glance at, bring a principle out, and let them have a deeper look as they grow older. But at any rate, long term, that's what I'm thinking. That's what we're leaning towards. So we are starting with the book of Judges, and the first lesson is just simply an introduction to the idea of the judges. And so encourage you, read at home, Judges chapter 2, and then sit down and read that with your child. There's going to be some words there that they might not fully understand, and there's the pronunciation of the different names of the places and stuff like that. That's okay. Just go through and read it with them and talk to them about what's going on there with the judges and the people of Israel and their covenant with God. So we have the stages of history of Israel. So first we have God calling out to Abraham, go, and he makes this covenant with him, and that takes place. And then, Abraham has Isaac, and Isaac has Jacob, and Jacob has Joseph. And that's where we step into this other section of time where, they're in Egypt, right? And they're flourishing, and the population's booming. And then there's the time of oppression while they're in Egypt. And then we have Moses. Moses comes out, and he brings us into a new chapter of history where he is leading with the help of the Levite priests and with Aaron, but he's leading the Israelites through the wilderness. We covered that. And then Moses dies, Aaron dies, and Joshua comes up, and Joshua takes the mantle. And then Joshua leads the people for a time. Joshua dies. And then we enter into what we're looking at now, and will for the next couple weeks, is the period of the judges, the time of the judges. And we have to make sure we get the context right, we understand this properly, because the judges here, sure, they judged Israel, and people brought cases to them, and they would judge them. But there was a lot more to it than just that. And so it's not just a judge in the modern sense of how we would think about it today, but there's more to it. And then from here, we move into the time of the kings, and that'll happen afterwards. And we're not going to touch on that in this workbook, but just so you have an idea of how it flows. And it's a nice way because it's one big history, right? When we look at the Old Testament of God's interaction with men. So it's nice to be able to know the different chapters and the different segments so that you can organize it in your mind and remember it well. And so my encouragement to you is first sit down, read chapter 2 to yourself. Maybe you and your wife, or you and your husband sit down and read chapter 2 together. And there's one thing I'm going to caution you on, based on the age of your child, the maturity of your child, the conduct of your child, is verse 17. Simply because if we read verse 17 in the ESV, English Standard Version, it says, "Yet they did not listen to their judges, for they whored after other gods and bowed down to them." And so right there's a word that your child may not know. depending on the kids at school, they may know that word. But there might come the question of, well, what is that? And so what I'll say to you is figure out what translation you want to read this to your child. So that's the ESV. It uses the word hoard. The NASB uses the word, sorry, I lost it here, harlot, right? So older term. The CSB and the NIV simply use the word prostitute, I believe, which I'm actually not as big on. I think harlot or hoard is actually the better term. And so when that comes up, if that comes up, how you should explain that to your child is simply that they were being unfaithful to God, that they made a covenant with God, that He would respond to them in a way, and they would respond to Him in a way, that they would be His people, they would be faithful. You know, you can look at the 10 Commandments, you shall have no other gods before me. Well, then they went after these other gods. And so you can use that example. You can talk about the importance, because it's one of the main points today, the importance of being faithful in our covenants and our relationships and whatnot. And so that is what that word means. And I'll leave that to you to figure out. I'm simply going to explain it to my child and explain that and talk. We've talked before about, you know, well, what does faithful mean? When we went through the 10 Commandments, you know, you shall not commit adultery. Well, that's a word they never heard before. And so we talked about how a husband should love his wife in a very special way that he loves no one else. And a wife should love her husband in a way that she loves no one else. And so this could be an example of, well, that husband went and loved someone in the way that he should only love his wife, or vice versa. And that is being unfaithful. And so God is using the imagery of Him being the bride of Israel, Israel is the bride of Him, and that they were being unfaithful. So there's that. The cycle of Judges is something to point out. Judges, we see a pattern arise. And I think in primary, but at least in grade 1, your children would have been studying patterns in math, you know, triangle, circle, square, over and over and over. And they'd be recognizing patterns. One of the patterns that we see in the book of Judges is that the people rebel against God. They're unfaithful to God. God hands them over to a foreign nation who then oppresses them. Then in their oppression, they call out to God. God raises a judge who frees them from the oppression and then judges them and leads them for a time. The judge dies. The people rebel against God. He hands them over to a nation. The nation oppresses them. In their oppression, they cry out for a judge or for deliverance, and God raises up a judge to deliver them. And we see this happen over and over and over and over. And so there's a cycle there. So first, there's a couple points to be made just from that. And one of those is the importance of strong leadership and strong personal conviction. Strong leadership is really important. If you have a weak leader in the church or in the home, then those people are not going to be led well. They're not going to be provided for or protected. And then, well, their faith will be weak. Their ways will be weak. They'll be malnourished. And then strong personal conviction, because there was a remnant, right? There was always this remnant that carried on and remained to be faithful. And that would have been those with a strong personal conviction. What would happen is the strong leader, or the leader, let's just say, in some of those cases, they would exit this situation or scenario. They would leave the story, death or otherwise, and then those who now are without a leader, they would fall. But if they had a strong personal conviction, then they remain. And they look for the next leader, and they hope that God will provide one. But that they're not reliant on someone else to provide them their faith. They have faith in God all by themselves. So that's an important thing. There's also a point to be made here about the work of pain and suffering. A lot of the times we look at pain and we see it as the problem, you know, and sure it is. It's a result of the curse. But there's a beauty to pain that God has used in our pain God calls out to us. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Problem of Pain, he really talks about this, that pain and suffering is the megaphone that God uses to awaken a sleeping world, to show us the need for him. And that's exactly what we see here in the book of Judges, is they become oppressed by this nation, and in their suffering, they realize we need God. We cannot do this on our own. We cannot deliver ourselves. We need God. And that will happen a lot in our life. As we go through hard times, it reminds us, lean not on your own understanding. Don't rely on your own strength, but rather trust in God. And so that's what we need to do. And so you can emphasize that to your child. It's a point that a child can understand. You can talk about their growing pains when they're going to sleep, and their knees and their legs and stuff, they start to feel pain there. Oh, it's because you're growing, and so you feel that. You wouldn't want to be the size of a baby your whole life, would you? No, of course not. And so we go through that pain. Or you can talk about, when they go to the dentist, or when they have a wiggly tooth and they have to pull it out, and there's this second of pain, of fear, but it needs to happen, and there's a sense of relief after that. Or if they've been sick, that the body creates a fever, which we don't like and we find uncomfortable, but it does that, to kill the virus inside you, kind of thing. And so there's the natural side, and then you can talk about, you lift weights to get strong. You study difficult topics to get smarter, and God will lead you through hard times to rely on him more. And so there's that. That can come through as well in the book of Judges. Points to highlight to our children. The Israelites gave in. They wanted to be like those around them. They looked at the ways and the gods that the people around them were serving, and they decided, we want to be like them. We don't want to be unique. We want to blend in. And that's a very big problem, and a problem that still exists today. A lot of kids today, depending on what period of life they're in, junior high, they tend, if I remember correctly, they want to stand out to some degree. And then in high school, they just all clump together. And even in these early ages, in elementary school, they want to be special, and they want your praise, and they want to be your favorite, and that kind of thing. But at the same time, they also want to be like other kids. And there's a balance of, well, that's to be expected, and that's understandable. They want to be able to swing high on the monkey bars like that kid, or they want to be able to climb that thing like that kid does, and all these other things. But there's sinful things that people do. And as they grow up, they're going to want to do those things to fit in. What we have to remind them of, and from the book of Judges, is it does not matter what the world thinks of you. It doesn't matter what all the other kids are doing. If they're all on the playground and they're doing this, or they're watching that show, or they're playing that game, or whatever, they're doing these things, and negative behaviors, sinful behaviors. What we have to remind them of is it doesn't matter what they think of you. It matters what God thinks of you. And just because everyone else is doing something does not mean that that is the right thing to do. And so you can point that out to them. That in this book, in this collection of stories of the judges, we see that the people wanted to be like the nations around them. And that never led to a quality of life or a right standing with God. It always led to oppression and them crying out for rescue. And so don't give in to peer pressure. Don't be like the people around you. Stand for God even when everyone else is opposed to him. The importance of leadership. This is a lesson that we see throughout this book. We see a lot of quality leaders, and a lot of them later on abandoning that quality. We have some really miserable leaders. Samson and Jephthah, absolutely miserable leaders through and through. But and we'll talk about that in the coming weeks when we get to those stories. However, there's an importance of the quality of leader, that we want a strong leader, that we want God to build up, to train leaders who we can trust. And that's in the home and in the church. And so one of the things you can do this week as you go through this lesson, you talk about that. You can name off the different judges that we see throughout the book. And as we go through the coming weeks, they'll learn more about them. but is to remind them that God has put leaders in their place, both in the home and in the church, for a reason, and that we should support those leaders. And it sounds weird saying that as one of their pastors, but it's true. It's biblical, and it's important. I look at the leadership that I had in my home and the leadership that I had throughout the churches, and I had some wonderful leaders. My father's a great leader of our home. And I had some wonderful pastors, and I had some other pastors that weren't that fantastic, and so there's that. That's an important thing. I'd say encourage them to support, and one of the great ways that you can do that is just simply through prayer. Take time to pray. Pray for your husband. Get them to pray for their father, as the spiritual leader of their home, their mother as well, but the father's to be the head of the home, and there is an importance to that. So have them do that, and then take the time to pray for myself and for Pastor Tim. And to you, the parent, as a side note as well, there's an importance here of being a quality leader. There's a trend among many of the judges that they do good, and then as time goes on, they do less good, and they seem to fail. And then the people abandon God. You must lead your family well. I've said it over and over, and I'll continue to. It is one of the greatest responsibilities that you will have. This is not something you are going to retire from. Until the day you die, you are to lead your family well. It's very important. And so be a quality leader. Be a leader who is in the Word of God, who is relying on God, trusting God, and leading His people well. So do that. That is our look into the book of Judges. We're going to continue specifically with some of the judges there next week. There's a word search to do, but if you look forward over the next couple pages, there's actually these coloring pages that I purchased for us to use, and they are, in my opinion, impressive. In fact, I'm going to print off some of them just for myself so that when Lily and Hudson are sitting down to color them, if we can get Hudson to color them something other than blue, that I might color them with them too, because they're detailed and that's somewhat relaxing if you've never done that. If you want one of those printed off or photocopied for yourself to do with your children, just simply let me know and we'll make that happen. But I hope you have a great week, and I hope you honor God in all that you do and that you lead your family well.